Welcome to Killer Women with your host, bestselling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Alyssa Sheinmel. Alyssa is the New York Times bestselling author of several novels for young adults, including A Danger to Herself and Others, The Castle School for Troubled Girls, and Faceless. Such Sheltered Lives is her adult debut. Alyssa grew up in Northern California and New York and currently lives and writes in New York. Welcome, Alyssa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I love your cover. Alyssa and I actually have the same editor. I have been hearing about Such Sheltered Lives for such a long time. Your Sarah, our editor, is such a fan, so that was really fun.
Oh, oh,
And
that's so wonderful to hear.
yeah, and I loved it. I devoured it. So before we dig into all the fun things, can you tell our listeners about Such Sheltered Lives?
Such Sheltered Lives is the story of three sort of A-list celebrities who find themselves all at the same very exclusive rehab facility on Shelter Island. Amelia Blue Harris is the first. She is struggling with an eating disorder, and she is the grief-stricken daughter of a Gen X rock star. Lord Edward of Essex is the second son of a British aristocratic family, excuse me, um, who is struggling with alcoholism and opioid addiction. And Florence Bloom is a pop star who is determined to prove her worth. She feels that she is very underrated, and she's struggling with, I would say, just about everything. And when the book opens, a body has been found nearby the center on Shelter Island, and we don't know what the connection for that dead body is to the center or to these three characters. And over the course of the book, we follow each character. They're each separate narrators of the book. So we follow them as they deal with their therapy because they're there for treatment, but also as they sort of unwittingly, without meaning to, tug at the strings that will solve the mystery of the body on the beach.
Yeah, so much fun. We were actually just even before we started recording talking about sort of the world's obsession with wealth, with famous people, and our sort of desire to know, like, why they make bad decisions, feeling like we're sort of part of their lives when of course we're not. I'm just curious to know, because you're living out sort of close to Shelter Island. Tell
Yeah.
us how this idea came to be.
Well, this idea actually began when I read an article about a very exclusive rehab center in Zurich, Switzerland, that was for ultra high net worth individuals. And I was fascinated by this place. After I read the article, I couldn't stop thinking about like what would lead someone to a place that most of us have no idea even exists, and how would people come to be there? And so I kind of sat on that idea for a while. And as I thought about it, these three characters took shape. And when I started writing, I actually wrote the first few chapters in Zurich, which I've never been to. And it just wasn't feeling right. And book I've ever written hasn't necessarily taken place somewhere that I've lived or spent a tremendous amount of time in, but it's always taken place somewhere that is meaningful to me. And no offense to Zurich, which I'm sure is very beautiful, but it's just not a place that ever like had a huge hold on my imagination. And so I moved the events to Shelter Island, which is near the east end of Long Island, which is where I've spent a lot of time. And it's suddenly the story seems so much clearer. I could see exactly what the place looked like. I knew exactly what it felt like. I knew exactly what the air smelled like, and it just made it move so much more smoothly in my imagination, for sure.
That's so interesting. Well, and it makes total sense. I mean, you all are, because of where you live also, like you are in a place where a lot of people own second homes, and there's an
Yeah.
incredible amount of wealth from people who, live mostly in New York and come out for their weekends and holidays and whatnot. And I know, this is your debut adult novel, which I want to talk about a little bit too, but I'm wondering about sort of the themes of this. Is it super different from books that you wrote for young adult?
I mean, I think that people who've read my young adult books will recognize me in this book. I hope they will. I think a lot of the books that I've written in the past have touched on they've touched on wealth, they've touched on privilege, but they've also certainly touched on mental health issues. And I've written several books that took place at like exclusive private schools. So it's not such a leap from an exclusive private school to an exclusive treatment center. I mean, it is, but it isn't.
Yes, right.
And so I think, if you're, I wrote a book, my last YA book that was kind of my own and wasn't based on an IP project, 'cause I've written a few of those, was called The Castle School for Troubled Girls. And it took place at a boarding school in rural Maine, um, that was a therapeutic boarding school. So kind of a similar setting. It's very isolated, completely different story, really, truly a different setting. But, I think those isolated settings. I also have another book that takes place in a mental institution called A Danger to Yourself and Others. So I think this is not intentional on my part, but I think I'm clearly drawn to these sorts of environments, and that, again, what leads people to be somewhere that most of us are unfamiliar with or don't even know exists.
Yeah. And the idea of mental illness, it sounds like also like sort of like, I mean, and that is, of course, it's such a, I mean, it's such a hot topic. I hate to even refer to it that way, but I think particularly post-pandemic, right? We are all like,
Right.
and the way that it's impacting for sure young people, but kind of everybody, right? And is that, I mean, is sort of that theme seems to run through your books as well.
Yeah.
And, can you t talk about sort of, is that just understanding human nature and crisis, or, where does that stem from?
Yeah. I mean, I think we write about the things that are important to us, whether we intend to or not. And
Yeah.
so, like with this book in particular, Amelia Blue's character struggles with an eating disorder. She struggles with anorexia. And most people don't know that anorexia is actually the second most deadly mental health issue, second only to opioid addiction. And if I could like get up on a soapbox and shout that to the world, I would. And this is the closest I can come to doing that. I just don't think we talk about it nearly enough. And I think, so that's something that I talk about as much as I possibly can. And I think the other thing, particularly with Amelia's character as well, is, and this isn't necessarily a mental health issue, but of course it is something that affects our mental health, is someone who's struggling with grief. And I think, you know, my mother passed away a few years ago, and ever since then, every book idea that I have has something to do with the loss of a parent. I'm not doing it intentionally. It's just we write about the things that are important to us.
Right.
That's what's on my mind. And so, I think that's part of how I'm working out my grief, is by writing about grief and other people who are struggling with grief. And so, like I said, I think we just write about the things that are important to us, and maybe on some level the things we're going through, even if we don't realize that's what we're doing. Because it certainly
Yeah.
was never my intention to write, I'm not writing about my grief. Amelia's situation with the mother she lost is very different from my situation with my mother, but also it's not. Grief is universal. And I think that's the other thing about this book. These are incredibly privileged people and an incredible who are living in very rarefied air. And yet I hope they're struggling with things that are relatable, across those socioeconomic lines. And grief is universal. If you're lucky enough to love someone, then you're unfortunate enough to grieve someone.
Yeah, no, and I lo lost my dad a while back too, and I know
I'm so
that
sorry.
the weird found the loss of foundation you lo from losing a parent. It's
Oh
so
my God.
it's such a universal thing, and I actually think it's to your point. It's interesting because like there are moments, of course, where these characters do things where I'm like I, I don't have I have no personal experience with anything that they're talking about. And yet
Right.
at the same time, like there are moments like, and I was telling you earlier as well, like Edward and, he in particular, just something sort of like, because he's, the younger, we always know the heir and the spare, there's the idea that
Yeah. Yeah.
the second aristocratic child is always like less important than the first child. And it's sort of the way that his whole life is managed. And a lot of these characters, right, that their lives are managed for them, that wealth does not buy you independence, right?
Right.
And for sure, fame does not buy you independence. If anything, it buys you the opposite of independence, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the case of these characters, particularly with Edward and Amelia, they're both people who were born into this. This was not something they pursued or they chose. And so, I think in particular, it's interesting with Amelia because he is very famous, but not for anything that she did. Like
Yeah.
in Edward's case, there are things he's done over the years that have garnered him notoriety, not necessarily in a good way. But Amelia's fame is entirely tied to her parents. And she feels almost like a stand-in for a reader who does not have experience with this world, because she was born into it, but she does not feel of it. I think Florence longs for it. She ran headlong into fame. That was what she always wanted. And Edward has a really complicated relationship with it. I think he is famous, and he is struggling to figure out, okay, who, if my family of origin is the reason I have all of this fame and privilege and notoriety, I am really struggling with my family of origin. How do I figure out who I am outside of my family of origin when I don't know how to be in the world except for as, a member of the British aristocracy? Like I don't know how to have a job. I never finished school. He doesn't know, because he didn't have to. I mean, his
Right.
parents, his family said, we'll find you a job when the time comes. You don't need a degree. And so now he's in his late 20s in the book. He has to kind of figure out, okay, how do I make a life for myself? Do I want to make a life for myself outside of this family and outside of all of this fame?
Right. And that means, but it means so few choices. Like, right. I mean, like he loves a woman that his family doesn't think is appropriate for him. And,
Right.
I mean, there's all that, like, and it is right. But they have really sort of handcuffed him because as you said, he's not really equipped to live in the wild. He's not been
Yeah.
giving the tools that he needs.
Not the tools at all.
No. So, and
Yeah.
I just, it's funny because I think what I love about these kinds of books, and I think we are so sort of, there's so much curiosity about wealth and fame, but I also love it because I think it exposes the sort of unenviability of these people, right? Like,
Yeah.
because we always want to look at it and be like, well, of course, if I had a private jet, my life would be perfect, right? And yet
Yeah.
you just see all the flaws and all the sort of hardship. And if that part's universal, like you do not escape this life period, right?
No. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but money doesn't buy happiness.
It doesn't.
And it certainly, doesn't buy mental health. And, I think, you know, my husband and I always talk about like, what would we do if we won the lottery or anything like that? And it frightens me.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I'm like, that is not something I would want.
No, I mean, I feel the same. It seems like a silly thing to be like, oh, I wouldn't take them $100 million, but I do think, and you read the statistics about it, that people who win the lottery end up like bankrupt within so many. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah. It's like the curse of the lottery, right?
it is. And it's just, I think, and to the point you just made, I think the same thing can be said of just like wealth in general. Like there's that whole study that did like where are people, who is the happiest? And it's
Right.
like people who can afford the basics. They're not trying to decide if they eat or they heat their house. But beyond that, like it's not a whole lot higher where you get ha exponentially happier by having more. So,
Yes.
and that's
Yes.
such a hard thing for us to digest.
I think both things can be true. It can be true. These characters, because of what they were born into, or in Florence's case, like worked their way into, they ended up facing a lot of issues that most of us will never face. And at the same time, they're incredibly lucky. They're able to afford the resources to go to a place like Russia's Recovery and get therapy and get help. So
Right.
it's not like poor little rich girl. Like they definitely are very lucky, but they're still struggling with things that people across the socioeconomic strata
Yeah.
struggle with.
Exactly. I think I love that idea. So I'm curious to know, like this was your first adult novel. So
Mhm.
what, how did it switch? Was it the idea that you felt like couldn't be a YA book or were you sort of hoping and I'm curious about that always.
So after I read that article about the rehab center in Zurich, I had the idea for this book, but I wasn't sure if I should write it as a YA or adult. So I actually wrote two versions of the first few chapters, one that was YA and one that was adult, because I couldn't make up my mind, which kind of felt better. And I think what was interesting to me about it wasn't necessarily what was different about the YA version versus the adult, but what was similar. I mean, obviously, I like to use the character of Florence. She kind of, I think is the best example of what was different and what was similar. It was different in that, the teen version of Florence, her, instead of having a manager that she paid, her mom was her manager.
Yeah.
And instead of having gone to rehab a dozen times, this was her first time at rehab. But the similarities were that they were both trying to make it sound like they were totally not scared about going away when they were really very frightened. And they were just, both versions of them were petulant and angry. And I think with the adult version of Florence, who's nearly 40 years old, it's really important in her character that she still sounds like a teenager in a lot of
Right.
ways and still sees the world like a teenager in a lot of ways. And I think that made me fall in love with her a little bit more. And so I think that's why I gravitated more and more towards writing as an adult book. And then as I plotted it out and decided where I wanted the story to go, it was like, okay, this is really an adult novel. I like to write, I can, and I don't always have this luxury, but what I really love to do is write the first like 5 or 10 chapters before I've written an outline or before I've decided where the story is going, and just get a sense of the place and the characters. And so I did that in both versions, in the YA and the adult. And after when I got that stopping point where I was like, okay, I want to stop and plot this and see where this is going, just the adult version and the twists and turns that I wanted to have felt like, okay, this should be an adult book. And plus I really loved what it meant for the characters.
Yeah, I guess so. Your process is a little. I mean, everybody's process I find is a little bit different, but that's a different kind of mix of sort of pantser plotter. So tell us about how you do that. So when you go in, like, did you start with Florence? Sounds like maybe Florence was sort of the first. And what was that?
Mhm.
How do you sort of free write that? Do you stop yourself? Tell us about that process because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of aspiring authors who listen, and I think hearing different processes is always so valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't always get to do this when I'm under contract on a book and I have to, write, before I can even write a word, I have to write a pitch and I have to write a synopsis. So I don't always get to do this. But what I really do love when I have the opportunity is I get an idea and I just kind of start writing. Like I said, maybe the first 5 chapters, once in a while, as many as 10. Um, and it just gives me a chance to really know the characters, know the place, and also decide where the story is going in a more like organic way than sitting down and kind of looking at it from 30,000 feet. But always what happens, again, it's very organic. It's like I hit a wall around like chapter 8, say, where I'm like, okay, I can't keep going until I know where this is going. And then because I love an outline, so then I stop and I make a beat by beat outline. I think outlines are great, and they're just guidelines. I mean, I will say I will write incredibly detailed outlines and then the book changes so much once I'm actually writing it, but it's really helpful. And I think it's incredibly helpful too when you're on deadline to have an outline, because then you know exactly what you have to do every day. There's no, oh, I'm sitting down with writer's block or anything. I know exactly what my assignment is one day to the next. And so I'm grateful for outlines. I love an outline, but I
I,
do love that freedom in the
Yeah, I
beginning.
love the idea of an outline. I've never actually successfully done that, but I'm curious to know, so when you're writing and the book goes off outline or what is there a sense of like are do the twists remain the same and you're just like you have to figure out how to get back to them or does sometimes it totally change? I'm curious about that too.
I mean, there's no like hard and fast rule. I would say it's different for every book, but I've had both happen where it kind of another twist presents itself, or a twist that I thought was going to work just isn't working on the page. Um, but I think, I think of my outlines just as, like I said, guidelines, and I'm not so married to them. So I allow myself that flexibility to see, like, you know, um, to see if something isn't working on the page in the way that I thought it would, and that happens. I mean, that happens a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I love the idea, like when you said, to sell a book, you have to write a synopsis. Every synopsis I've ever written, and so Pinky Squirrel will be my 17th novel, and every time, I've written a synopsis and been like, here's what's going to happen at the end of the book. I'm like, well, that didn't happen, but
Yeah,
but
I know sometimes you hand it in and you're like, surprise.
yes, you're like it just sort of changed a little bit, but yeah, I think that there is something about once the characters get talking, right? They kind of have their own agenda, and I sort of I particularly love Amelia and Edward sort of run into each other, right? They have these
Right.
interactions at the center, which I also think is so interesting because. Of course, there's this sort of both of them a little bit wounded birds, and this like and I that dynamic was so fun. So I'm always curious to know was with those sort of big things already sort of fleshed out, those were in the outline and how they came together.
Yeah. I always knew that Amelia and Edward were gonna explore together, and sometimes they would just have been alone too much. I needed them to have each other to bounce off of, and I loved their characters, and I felt like they would really connect. Um, and I think they're just such an interesting difference because, like I said earlier, Edward is trying to figure out who he is outside of his family of origin. And Amelia, after her whole life trying to reject her family of origin, is finally starting to wonder what would life be like if I allowed myself to hold them a little closer. So they're
Yeah.
struggling in some ways with opposite issues, but at the same time, I think because they both have such meaning associated with their family of origin, they're able to connect with each other and empathize with each other and help each other. I hope.
No, for sure. And there's that us against them, right? Because there's this idea
Right.
that and the therapists are a little bit manipulative, and then the staff, there's a lot of sort of, and we don't do spoilers, so you have to read it, but there's a lot of like other things going on. And I think,
Yeah.
so they sort of think like, okay, and I trust this person because they're in the same position I am. And then there's also like, when this person's an addict and, or, maybe I can't trust them. So I love all of
Right.
that. There's so much unknown for each of those characters in this, in the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything just is always a little bit off, or at least that was my goal, is that everything is always a little bit off. So even when they feel like they're connecting with someone, it doesn't feel safe. It doesn't really entirely feel safe.
Which is because they're not safe with themselves, right? I mean, that's sort of the idea.
Exactly.
They don't even know who they are or where they belong. And so of course they can't connect in any really healthy way. That makes, but it's beautifully done. Now I want to talk about the lyrics because it's kind of amazing. In this book, you have written, there's a lot of writing of lyrics, that, Florence does. And
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you, because that to me feels like such a different, it's like writing poetry, feels like such a different skill. So how did you do that? Have you done that before?
Never done it before. And I have to tell you, so when I got the idea for this book, I knew I wanted music to be in it, but I really didn't feel like I was like, I almost felt like, look, I'm a novelist. I'm not a poet. I'm not a lyricist. I have no right to write lyrics. And luckily for me, right around that time, I happened to read Daisy Jones and the Six, which
Yeah,
is completely different book, not
totally.
at all the same
No.
genre, happens to have a lot of music in it. And I felt like that book was like, oh, novelists are allowed to write lyrics. It's okay. It almost felt like that book gave me permission.
Yeah.
And so from then on, I kind of just flew with it. And I really love, I mean, I loved writing the Florence chapters, because she really thinks in lyrics, even
Yeah.
when she's not writing, she's writing. Um, and so to be able to kind of be out of myself when I was writing her, where every so often she just kind of breaks into lyrics and brainstorms a song, was just so much fun for me. Like, so selfishly, I would have had even more lyrics in it if I could. Like, it was
Well,
just a joy to
I
write.
think they were beautiful lyrics. I was like, I mean, the thing with Daisy Jones and the Sixes, I read that book and I thought, oh, I thought it was like actually a story about a real band. Of course,
Oh,
I was not paying any attention. Somebody recommended it, and I thought, oh, okay. And then I was like looking for the music, but I felt the same way when and I did know that this was a novel, so I did not Google the music, but I did feel like, I could imagine like Florence's lyrics being put to music. I thought that was real. So I'm so impressed. I have to say,
oh, thank you.
that seems impossible.
Yeah. And I also gave myself the freedom to write really bad lyrics because sometimes she's struggling to write. That was just really freeing for me that they're supposed to be bad, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and actually, if we're honest about music, some of the lyrics are just really bad, right?
Very true.
But they're
Very
really,
true.
I think it is such a good insight into her. And in a way, also, like as a writer, sometimes it's a struggle to like talk about what your character's thinking, right? Because you feel like people don't really sit around and go, well, now I feel this, or I'm thinking this. So the lyrics are such a wonderful way to get to the core of her emotions without like
So
knocking us
true.
over the head.
Yeah. Especially because she is a character who will never be honest about her emotions, the people around her, to herself. The only way you can really know what she's thinking is in her lyrics.
And I feel like shows her character arc in the story, right? Because the sort of the healthier, stronger she gets,
Hmm.
the more we see the lyrics. So I thought that was,
Yeah.
anyway, I thought that was such an unusual thing in a book that I had. I mean, yes, you're right. I experienced it in Daisy Jones, but not in the same way. So
Right.
I really, really appreciated that. Now,
Oh, thank you.
can you tell us, and you can say no, it's definitely, are you working on something now? And is it another adult? So I'm just, and if you want to say, like, I also appreciate the inside the creative bubble. Sometimes you have to be like, I can't talk about it.
Yeah, my general rule of thumb is I don't talk about things while I'm writing them, but like I have a few things that are further along. So my next book is going to be a YA. Don't have a title for it yet, but it is also about a girl who has lost her mother. Again, like that's really all my ideas right now are people who've lost a parent. So in this case, it's a girl who's lost her
Yeah, it's
mother
a lot of
also.
us, so it's fair.
Yes. And the girls across the street from her pass away and under mysterious circumstances, and she doesn't really want to get dragged into it, but sort of unwittingly gets dragged into it she goes to a private school where the stakes of popularity are very high, and she really just wants to stay on the right side of the popular kids. And so she kind of unwittingly gets dragged into the mystery around these girls' deaths. Um, and so that's the next thing I have. I don't know exactly when it's coming out, probably sometime in early 2027. Like I said, it's still very much in process. And then hopefully after that, another adult book. I know we have the same editor, so I've been pitching some ideas to our wonderful editor, and I'm so excited to get back to writing that genre as well. I really love doing both. I'm
I was
really
gonna
lucky
say
that I
that
get to
must
do
be
both.
really fun because it's just a different, it sort of changes things up enough that you feel like it's fresh in a way the same, it's writing the same thing doesn't always feel that way.
Yeah, no, I feel really lucky. I hope I get to write both genres for a long time. I hope people want to hear from me in both genres if I'm lucky, because I
Absolutely.
really love doing both.
Absolutely. Well, we are going to be giving away a copy of Such Sheltered Lives either over on our Facebook group, Killer Women, or on through Instagram on the Killer Women podcast is our handle there. Alyssa, tell our listeners where they can find you, where you're going to be. I know you'll probably do an event at least in New York. All that.
Um,
What's the best place to find out that information?
so I do have a launch event in New York on January 22nd, and the best place to find me and find information about any events I have coming up and everything is my Instagram, which is at Alyssa Sheinmel. And I post on Instagram constantly, so you'll find out everything you want to know and hear a lot more about this book for the next month for
I
sure.
know, right? Exactly. Fantastic. Well, it was so much fun to talk to you and
You too.
yeah, and to share some editor stories. I've really appreciated that. That's been such a wild experience on my end too. So this business is so crazy, but Such Sheltered
So
Lives,
true.
such a fun read. Again, I has sort of a special spot in my heart for Edward in particular, which doesn't always happen. I think it's hard to write a really compelling man sometimes. So kudos.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today on Killer Women with Alyssa Sheinmel, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye bye.